Ben Rosser here, corn specialist with OMAFRA. Continuing on again with our little mini series on managing knolls. Going to have a little conversation with Jake Munroe. Jake's a soil management specialist with the field crop unit at OMAFRA, and going to talk a little bit about why knolls cause us issues in fields, some of the things you can do from a management perspective to try to manage some of those issues, and even touch a little bit on remediation and some approaches growers have taken to try to actually correct some of the issues that have started on knolls. So Jake, we're standing here in a field with a fair bit of topography variability just outside of Guelph. Obviously when we visually look across it, we can see big differences in growth, tops of knolls versus lower areas. What drives the differences in growth on top versus lower spots of knolls?
So right now we're standing and looking at a field that's showing variability in plant height, canopy coverage. We've got some nutrient deficiencies in different parts of the field, and really by and large they're predominantly a reflection of what's happened over the years in terms of topsoil being moved from the tops of slopes further down slope. And in this case, as we've seen on the most eroded knolls in this field, we've got no topsoil left on the tops of the knolls and have accumulated in some cases up to 4 feet or more topsoil down at the bottom of the slope. And there's a couple factors that might be at play. So first off, lack of available water. So on knolls, as we're going to talk about, that topsoil has been stripped off over time. We've got very low organic matter, and our sponge, our water holding capacity, has been greatly reduced. So that's probably number one, is water and water availability. But second is nutrients and the availability of nutrients. The other big factor, and it depends on the part of the province that you're farming in, but is pH. So there's lots of different factors that it can impact productivity on eroded knolls.
What's really driven those differences to make those differences high versus low spots of those fields?
These changes didn't just happen overnight. Of course, certain erosion events can be very severe, and we can lose large amounts of topsoil off of knolls in a single rain event. But in almost every case in Ontario, we're dealing with basically a legacy of decades, if not centuries, of soil degradations. On those tops of knolls where over the years, tillage as well as water has moved topsoil down from the tops and side hills down to the valleys, we've got very little available water as well as very little available nutrients.
So we always talk about tillage and different types of tillage implements and their impact on conservation and trying to reduce soil losses. Are they all the same, or how do our concerns differ for different types of tillage implements?
Tillage erosion maybe doesn't get as much profile as water erosion does typically in Ontario, but it's still a really big factor and has been a factor over many years. In many cases, degrading some of our soils, particularly our soils that have a lot of complex topography like the one we're standing in right now. So what we want to look at if we're wanting to kind of reduce the movement off of knolls or off of side hills is looking at less aggressive tillage, maybe vertical tillage, something a little bit lighter that's not going to be moving as much soil.
So Jake, we kind of started talking about tillage implements, but you started using the term tillage erosion. When you're in school and you hear erosion, we always think wind and water erosion as mechanisms of moving soil, right? But really, tillage erosion is maybe one that's kind of been misunderstood or not considered as strongly as ozone, but it's probably still a really big driver.
So it's a really big culprit for lost productivity on our fields, particularly in Ontario because of the complex topography that we have. And the really interesting thing about tillage erosion is that it's not only moved topsoil downslope in and of itself, but it's also in some cases removed the topsoil entirely and exposed subsoil. And depending on your soil type and the texture of that subsoil may be much more vulnerable to either wind erosion or water erosion.
One thing you brought up was higher pH in some of these soils now that you've eroded that topsoil. How do we know that it's a high pH in these spots?
So if you've got eroded knolls, whitecaps, you've got obvious issues with plant establishment and growth on portions of your field, I really recommend first, take a look on one of our soil maps to see what kind of soil type you have, and you can get a sense of what the parent material might be or what kind of soil you're dealing with. Is it a high pH soil or is it prone to acidity? But really the foolproof way to determine what you're dealing with in terms of pH on those eroded knolls is to take a soil sample. There's a really simple way to test and see if you've got high pH conditions or carbonate materials right at the soil surface, and it's it's simply just using 5% or dilute hydrochloric acid, dropping a few drops on top, and seeing if you get bubbling.
So Jake, we were at the field at Ridgetown looking at it where acidity became a problem on those sandy knolls that we were on. I don't think we want to make the message that if you've got a knoll and it's doing poorly that it's an acidity problem, and in fact probably for large parts of Ontario it's the exact opposite of that, would you say?
In terms of eroded knolls or the impacts of tillage erosion on the landscape, predominantly in southern Ontario we're dealing with alkaline conditions or high pH soils on those eroded knolls, but it's not the same as a low pH condition like the one we looked at in Ridgetown. And so in those low pH eroded knolls, there's something you can do about it. You can apply lime. You can address that pH issue. On those high pH soils, on those high pH eroded knolls that are more common to southern Ontario, really we're looking at trying to do the best we can to first stop the erosion from happening off of those knolls, but then find some way to remediate that knoll through building up the organic matter. There's not much we can do to address a pH once it's become too high.
I guess the last question is, is there anything a grower can do now to fix this? Can we apply something, or can we do anything to try to help some of these issues that have been caused in these type of fields?
There are a handful of growers in Ontario who have been moving topsoil from low slope positions where it has accumulated over the years and moving that soil up to the eroded knoll, provide a better growing environment for these crops that we're growing on the knolls, and then making sure that we're leaving a minimum of at least 6 inches in those low slope positions. The key, of course, to having success with that system is then implementing practices that are going to make sure the soil stays in place. So no-till practices, if there's some tillage in the operation, keeping it to a bare minimum, cross slope, avoiding moving up and down the slope if possible, growing a cover crop to help stabilize the soil throughout the fall, winter, and maybe spring. Those are some of the practices that I think really need to go hand in hand with remediation. If you're looking at this as a solution to stabilize that soil, make sure that that water is not moving it and that you're not moving it by excessive tillage.